Okay, so let's get started. So welcome to Economics. I'll go over some of the items here on the Avenue to Learn site, and then we'll just cover chapter 1 today, and then we'll move on. So first, let's look at our weekly schedule. Here you can see what we're going to be doing every week. Today, we're just going to cover chapter 1, and then we'll catch up a bit later. So here you have the chapters in the textbook, and you have, the pages and material you're responsible for covering. Also, you have indicated here when the assessment items are. So we have 2 quizzes and a midterm and final. I'll talk about those in a moment. For your end, though, you want to make sure that you keep up with the readings. Overall, I think it's a fair course. There is a decent amount of material, but put the effort in, learn the material, you should do fine. So on the Avenue to Learn site, you have your weekly schedule, and you'll have what chapters we're covering each week, and you have your assessments. So now let's go back. We'll talk for a bit about the textbook. The textbook for this course is by Reagan. Have you guys got the textbook? Did you already purchase it online or the bookstore?
Yeah, I got my work bought me the hard copy, so I have that.
Okay, that's perfect. Yeah, so we don't. Okay, so you got the hard copy. So I'm not using the MyLab for anything. So basically, the MyLab will be just for you to get the electronic version, or if you have the hard copy, then you don't need to worry about it, okay? All of the assessments will be done in Avenue to Learn, okay? So again, if we go back to our main site, oh, and again, this is, so you guys got 2 textbooks, right? The micro and macro separately?
Correct.
Okay, perfect.
They're very similar. Like chapter 1 and 3 are exactly the same.
Yeah, they do that. I don't know. Some textbooks do that. Actually, other ones do for economics for some reason. Because a lot of times, if you're just learning macro, you want to at least introduce some of the micro concepts that will help out with the macro, like the supply and demand model. So that's why there's a bit of overlap. But after chapter 3, you'll see stark differences.
So we should be working on the macro or the micro book?
Micro first, and then we'll do macro.
Okay.
So these, if I go back to the weekly schedule, so you'll see the chapters here. So we'll skip chapter 2, but you'll be doing 1, 3, 4, 5, skip chapter 6, skip chapter 8. So you're going to be doing 1 to 11 with minus a few chapters. And then chapter 19, we'll start with macro. So there we'll start learning about GDP, inflation, and that sort of thing. So the macro is a little more, the concepts you learn there are a little more, I guess, I don't want to say useful, but they're a little more recognizable because you'll recognize a lot of the terms and concepts that you see them on the news a lot. So it's macro's a little more real world, I guess you could say, where micro is less so, but micro's more focused on individual markets. So we're just going to be covering the supply and demand model, and then we'll look at production and costs and things like that. But in macro, we'll learn more about inflation, GDP, unemployment, that sort of thing. Okay, so not too much else to say for the textbook. If you got it, that's great. You didn't have the hard copy. It's probably best to get this edition. So you guys should be fine if you got the hard copy. Also on Avenue to Learn, I post my PowerPoint slides. So if you go to this folder here, you'll see that they're all here. So today we're just going to cover chapter 1. So everything's laid out nicely. We have our evaluation plan here. So there's 2 quizzes. They're worth 10% each. And those will be held online in Avenue to Learn. And we'll have the first one on January 26th and the second one on March 16th. So I'll likely run these at the beginning of class, although we can, what are your preferences for these to be run at the beginning or at the end of class? Well, I guess we can talk about that later when we get closer to the quiz. And the midterm and final will be the entire class on these days here. So February 23rd and April 6th. And you have weekly practice exercises that you can do. So they're listed here. And these are the solutions here. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. The course is set up here so you have everything you need. So that's pretty much it. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Every class I'll go over the lecture slides. We'll do some multiple choice questions together to try and reinforce the concepts. And you have your weekly exercises. And then you just have 2 quizzes, a midterm and final. So does anyone have any questions before I start the lecture?
Are the quizzes in the midterm the multiple choice then, I guess? The
Yeah, it looks like, yeah, the desire to learn platform doesn't really give you much options to do non-multiple choice questions.
Yeah.
Basically, there's like batching of questions, and it's really hard to do economic. Like I could have open-ended questions where you just type in stuff. I haven't fully decided yet. The quizzes will be multiple choice, but I'll have to, when I get closer to the midterm, I'll give you a lot of detail. So the midterm might have a short answer question or two in there, but yeah, I'll have to see what I can put in that makes sense in terms of what's offered with this platform, right? But I'll probably put one or two on, especially since it's a small class. So, the grading isn't an issue.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? So well, we had a new person, but then they left. But all of you have the textbook? It's Tom.
Yeah, I have it.
Okay. Tula. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong.
Yeah. I actually got the online copy, but I didn't see two different books there. So I guess I'll have to go back and check to see.
Okay. Let me see here. There should be a link to that. Maybe I can go into that.
Actually, never mind. I do see it now.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So how do you get into it? Are you going separately or are you going through Avenue to Learn?
I actually went through the link provided. However, the actual link that it popped up, it's showing that the course instructor is Kristen Stoller. Yeah, and but as far as finding the actual textbooks themselves, it was really just a matter of entering in the codes that were provided, which is fairly easy to find.
Okay. Let me know if anyone else has any issues, and I guess let me just check this. Oh yeah, this is I think it's in Getting Started. Yeah. So anyone else who hasn't done this yet, you have your instructions right here. Apologies, I should have put a link to this on the main page, but it's here anyways under Content and Getting Started. So this PDF file will give you the information you need to get access. So you can either have a hard copy or you can get the e-textbook. For the e-textbook, it's hosted in my lab, so that's why you have to go into my lab, and both of them should be in there. Okay, and I just realized my stream wasn't showing all of the participants, but now so it looks like we actually have 5 of you, so that's good. There's, I believe, 11 students are supposed to be in the class, so we got close to half. So I guess the new ones that joined us are Carly and Karma, and yeah, so B2 is asking if we need to get both books. So yeah, and again, this wasn't my choice. I feel bad, but I wasn't able to change the textbook because I was thinking of changing it to one where both macro and micro are covered in one physical copy. But the way the course has been set up, it's to have micro and macro from Greg and 2 separate textbooks. So you do have to get both, and you can just get the electronic version. And if you go to this PDF document, you'll get instructions on how to get it. So basically, you go to this link here. You have the course ID here. This is one of the administrators. You gotta set this up, and yeah, you just go in here, sign up. If you already have a Pearson account, just log in. If you don't, you create one. And here are the options for payments. So it looks like it's okay. So you want to get the 95. Yeah, this one here won't have the ebook, and we're not using any of the assessments as part of my lab, so this wouldn't get you anything. So make sure you get the $95. And so once you pay, you get an access code and you can log in. For now, you can still go in here and get access to the e-textbook on a temporary basis. So if you're waiting for financial aid or anything like that, or for any reason, you should be able to just get this temporary access. So if you go to the next page, yeah, when you're on this site, if you click here, it should bring you to the main site where you can access the ebook, but you only have a 14-day trial, and so after that you need to pay. So even though it's $2, they're only charging 95, so that's pretty fair. Okay, and yeah. So is there any other questions? We'll get started with chapter 1. Are you guys all accountants, or are you just taking it for general interest?
Nope, not an accountant, engineering background. I'm just trying to finish the business admin course with the focus in finance.
Oh, nice. Okay. Oh, that would be a good combination, engineering and some economics and business. That's a good.
Yeah, well, that's what I notice is as I move along, the finance is the part that starts to really show. So
Yeah. You can't go wrong with engineering and finance.
yeah,
Well, plus in engineering, the math you do is much more rigorous than anything in business. Economics, it can get a little difficult, but we usually don't get into it really heavily until third or fourth year, especially in graduate school.
yeah. Okay, sounds good.
All right. Anyways, that's good. Okay. So I guess everyone else is a little quiet, so I'll take that as a hint to get going with the lecture. Yeah, go ahead.
I come from I guess, like financial services. I worked for one of the big 5 banks for the last about 10 years. So I'm really just taking this course as part of the Myonic Master Program. I'm doing another degree program. So, yeah.
Okay, so it's part of the requirements. So it's like it's a master's program you're in?
No. It's through the Myonic Master Program. So I already got the business administration diploma. So now I'm doing the degree program.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Oh, that's good. That's good. It's you're working full time while you're doing it, or?
Yeah.
That's tough. I commend you for that. But I guess as long as you're not doing a full course load, are you?
No, I'm doing 2 courses per semester while working full time. So yeah, I have 2 screens open always, but it's not that bad.
Yeah, 2 is manageable, but I've seen some students have 5 courses and working full time, and yeah, that's a bit yeah. Okay, so that's good. All right, so let's get started then. So this is the intro chapter. So this chapter sort of introduces some key concepts and focused on why there is a discipline of economics. So we're just going to cover the main economic problem and discuss a few concepts such as opportunity cost and scarcity, essentially. So essentially, economics is a study of the use of scarce resources to satisfy seemingly unlimited human wants. So I'll just go over to our next slide here. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because this sort of says it all. So if you think of any human beings that are living together somewhere on Earth, they have scarce resources and they need to make stuff, right? We need to have food, shelter at the very least. And, if you think of our modern economy, we have thousands of goods and services that are produced using scarce resources. And an economic system is what takes those scarce resources and, that's what we use to make stuff with. And so in terms of these scarce resources, we can categorize them into 3 different categories. So we have natural resources. So these are land, any natural resource that can be used to make stuff with. So there's many of those. You could think of oil, copper, even gold is used for jewelry. So natural resources is an important input. And then, of course, to make stuff, we also, we use tools. So we use capital, we use machinery. And so that's another very important input. And lastly, human resources. For human resources, you can think of labor input. You could also think of, you could break that down further and think about entrepreneurial labor. So if you think of a firm, there's going to be workers that are making the goods and services, and the owner of the firm gets a profit sometimes if they're good at their business, and that's sort of a reward for their entrepreneurial labor effort. So anyways, these are all scarce, right? So of course then there's a problem. It's not maybe so much of a problem, but it's maybe think of it as a challenge. Because these are scarce, we need to there's trade-offs involved when we make decisions to use them. So the inputs are limited or scarce, but at the same time, our wants and needs are seemingly unlimited. And so that poses a challenge because relative to our desires, existing resources are scarce. And so we need to think about opportunity costs. And opportunity cost is what we give up when we make a decision to use scarce resources. You could also think of time as being a scarce input as well. So scarcity implies the need for choice. So if resources obviously were abundant or unlimited, then there wouldn't be an issue. We wouldn't even need to have any study of economics because it wouldn't matter. We could be wasteful whenever we make a choice to use resources. The opportunity cost would be very small. It would be pointless to look at. But of course, that's not reality, and so our resources are scarce. So when we make a decision, any decision to use a scarce resource, there's an associated cost with that called opportunity cost. If we decide to, as a society, use our lumber to make homes, well, we can't use that lumber for anything else. If we decide to use, the citizens' labor to make something, we can't use that labor. We can use more, additional labor later on, but in that particular time period, whatever you use that labor for, you're not going to be using it for something else. And so whatever else you didn't use that labor for would be the opportunity cost. You can also think of the opportunity cost as the next foregone alternative. And it's a very general concept. And, if you think of just time, there's always an opportunity cost to your time. It's what else you could have done, your next best alternative that you could have done with that time. And that's why they say there's no such thing as a free lunch. Even if someone brings you to lunch and pays for it, there's still the opportunity cost associated with that time. And if there was something else better you could have done, maybe the opportunity cost would be quite high. It would be higher than, the value of the meal you got. So opportunity cost is quite general, and it's simply just the result of resources being scarce, and the fact that scarcity implies that when we make a choice, there's a trade-off, and associated with that, there's an opportunity cost. So scarcity forces choice, and choice, when we make choices, there's a trade-off, and those trade-offs involve opportunity costs. So there are three basic questions. These are better phrased as three fundamental questions of economics. So if you think of any human beings living together in a society, they have to answer these three questions. We have to answer the question of what to produce. So any society, there's different ways in which these questions are answered. We'll talk about that in a moment, but these questions need to be answered. So somehow we need to figure out what goods and services are going to be produced. And, here we're thinking about what are we going to make with our scarce resources? And, there's other questions that are related to this, such as, do we have enough to produce everything we want? We need to know what our population needs and wants are. So if we if we answer this question poorly, our standard of living isn't going to be very good, right? Because we could answer this question poorly and produce stuff and make goods and services that perhaps nobody wants or needs, right? We're very used to a market system, and so we'll also talk about that later, but it has a built-in mechanism to ensure that things are produced that we actually want and need. But there are many examples in other countries, especially in the past, where the government decides what's produced, and sometimes they get it very wrong, and there's shortages and things like that. And those are typically what we see in command economies or socialist or communist countries. So anyways, the what to produce question needs to be answered. We also need to answer the question how to produce. So if you could think of, okay, well, a good way to frame these questions is to think about our class being stranded on a deserted island. So we would obviously need to answer the what to produce question. And of course, we would be at first interested in shelter and food. And so we could come up with some ideas of what we should produce. Then we need to figure out how we should do it. And this is where efficiency becomes important. The logistics of I just think about you would need to assign people to tasks, make sure you're allocating labor effort appropriately. So if there are people in our class that have experience in the skilled trades, maybe there's a carpenter, we would probably want that person to be building shelter. And if there's people who have experience, farming, then they would be better to have them assigned to somehow getting food. So that's the idea here. So, as a society, we need to answer this question, how to produce. And again, we'll go into a little more detail about different economic systems and how to answer these questions. But some of the key questions are, if we're thinking of a modern economy, how should the production be done in a large factory, maybe with an assembly line, or should it be more decentralized into small factories? What production methods should be used? What types of capital should be used? Should it be more labor intensive or capital intensive? So these are the sort of questions that need to be thought of when we're thinking about the second question. And then the last question, so you can think of it as a story. So on our deserted island, we decided we want huts and shelter. Then we have to answer how we're going to go about making them. And then when we have huts and shelter, food, we need to decide how to divide that up. So you can think of what gets produced is actually the gross domestic product or national product, and that also represents the total income as well. And so, the third question is, how do we divide that up? Should people who work harder get more, get the better shelter or more of the food? How should we, how do we divide that up? Should we base it on, people who are taller get more or shorter? Should we give everyone an equal share, like in a communist, the ideals that would be associated with communism? So those are the sorts of questions. So when we talk about this third question, we're talking about how we're distributing the economic pie, or how the national income is distributed among the people. Okay, so again, this slide just is related to my example of being deserted on an island. So it's easy to think of the concepts in this context, and then you just sort of extrapolate to the modern economy. So again, if our class is stranded on a deserted island, and so any society that's living together must answer these questions. So for us on our deserted island, we would likely want to produce food and shelter, and then we need to figure out how to do that. What tools do we have? What skills do the people have that are in our class? What are the natural resources we have? What do we have to work with? How do we, execute these? We decided what we want to produce. How do we, execute on that and actually make them? And then when we have produced the goods and services in our economy, we need to figure out how we should divide them up. Should we share them equally? People who work harder or more ambitious or something like that, should they get more? How do we do that? And the better we answer these questions, the better our standard of living will be, especially when you're thinking of the how to produce. Remember, our resources are scarce. And so the better we are at, the more efficient we are at producing, the better the standard of living will be on the island. But it's not just, so that would be productive efficiency, but it's not just that. The what to produce question is important as well. If we decided to spend our time making necklaces with seashells on our island, then that's not very allocatively efficient. So allocative efficiency roughly means that you want to make stuff that people want and need. And so, we could be very efficient at producing stuff, but if we're producing stuff that no one wants and needs, then we're not allocative efficient. And so we want to score highly on both of these, because that would result in a higher standard of living. So if on our island we very clear and we get everyone involved and we get a clear picture of what people want and need, and then we make those with being as efficient as possible, not being wasteful, not having people who are not skilled at something doing something when we have someone else that can do it better. And then the third question is sort of more, I guess it depends on your ideology. But again, so this last question relates to inequality. So, in our economic system, we haven't really talked much about it, but the majority of the economic activity in Canada is through a market system. I wouldn't say it's a competitive market, but it is somewhat of a market system. And it tends to lead to high levels of inequality. So there's a lot of people who get a much bigger share of the economic pie than others. But in other countries some countries have experimented with socialism and communism, and in those systems, they have an ideology where everyone should share equally. We'll talk about some issues with that type of system as well in a moment. So anyways, the main idea here is, up to this point, very simple concepts. We have scarce resources that forces us to make choices. They involve opportunity costs. There are three fundamental questions that need to be answered in any society of human beings, and that's what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. You have to, these have to be figured out. So there's different. Well, we're going to cover basically two extreme economic systems and see how they go about answering these questions. So again, an economic system is, the thing in the middle here that is responsible for, it's a system. Think of how everyone works together and takes our scarce resources and makes goods and services. And so it's a mechanism that transforms our scarce resources into useful goods and services. And so, we'll see that there's two extremes. So we could have a market system or a command system, and then we'll talk about which ones are better or worse. There's also traditional economies. It's not really, I don't think we're going to look at much in detail, but for the most part of human history, this is the economic system that humans participated in, or it's the economic system that emerged for thousands of years. And this is just sort of, you could think of, tribes living together, and basically the what to produce question is very simple. It's basically shelter and food and, certain tools to be able to get better at catching fish, for example, or gathering food. But usually the job you did would be your father did or your mother did. And so there wasn't much economic freedom or anything like that. It was basically a system where you had very tight social constraints. You could think of there's other non-economic concerns as well. Now, the system that we have the most experience with is the market economy. And here a market economy is more of a decentralized economic system. It's consumer centered. It fosters innovation. However, it creates inequality and there is some instability. We'll go into more detail on these in a moment. And the other economic system is almost like the other extreme of a market system. A command economy is much different than what we're used to. In a command economy, the government has an explicit plan where they outline exactly what goods and services are going to be produced. And all of the firms are owned by the government, and the government follows those orders from the plan, and things get produced. And typically, for the most part, command economies were typically part of it's very complicated and a long history, but a lot of countries or a lot of people decided that communism would be something they would want to go for, and it's more than just an economic system though. But any communist system has in the past anyways has implemented a command economic system as part of there's actually been no pure communist society. A pure communist society is one that will be cashless, stateless, and everyone just works for the greater good of everyone. That's actually never happened. We've usually got to the point of socialism, where all of the means of production is owned by the government. There's a centralized economic plan, but the part of where you're supposed to be stateless and there's not supposed to be any dictator or government in charge hasn't ever been met in one of these countries. So a lot of times you say it's a communist state, but it's not, a pure communist economic system. Anyway, so these are the three different types of economic systems. We're going to look at market and command economies in some more detail and look at differences in how these two systems answer those questions, and we'll have a good idea of how the standard of living would differ between these two systems, because they answer these fundamental questions much differently. So again, the traditional economy, there's not too much to talk about here. So, you're thinking of economic questions being answered by habits and customs. Children work in the same jobs as their parents. We're typically thinking of farming, hunter-gatherer, small sort of groups of people. Anyone that would be supportive of these types of economies would suggest that they offer the advantage of stability and perhaps they emphasize, other non-economic things like spiritual, cultural aspects of life. But of course, I don't think any of us here would want to be alive and living in a traditional economy because you were extremely poor. You basically work, many hours every day just to have food, and many times you were not able to have enough food. And so, and then also you don't have any freedom here, right? You basically can't make any, you zero economic freedom. You're going to do whatever occupation that your family tells you. So anyway, so that's how, unfortunately that's how humans lived for most of human history. But there's not that much interesting going on here. The market system is much more interesting, and it's for the most part, our economy is based on a market system. Although there is still a very large role there's still a command element even in Canada and the U.S., right? Because the government is responsible for producing some goods and services, right? So in Canada, healthcare is dictated by the government. We don't have a market. There might be little aspects of a market here and there. For example, testing, when you go to get a blood test, those are private companies, and I think there's different ones like Dynalabs, so they compete on that part, but the government actually pays for it. And anything like surgeries, visiting the doctors, all of that stuff, those are all provided directly by the government. But in a market system, but for the most part, any consumer goods and services are primarily in a market system. They're not in a lot of times, a very competitive market. Like if you think of cell phone service, you have Bell, Telus, and Rogers. That's not a very competitive market. There's only 3 companies, but nevertheless, it's still a market. The government doesn't dictate what type of cellular service, what plans that we should have, or what types of phones we should have. It's all determined in a private market system. So in general, a market is just a set of arrangements between buyers and sellers that allows them to trade items for set prices. So it's essentially, in a pure market system, all you need is some private property. The government would only be there in a very limited way where they provide private property rights. So, and that's essential, right? If you make something and someone can just steal it from you, then there's going to be very little incentive in that system for anyone to make anything. So, if you don't have private property rights, you're going to be very, very poor. So you need private property rights, and then you're basically just thinking about people voluntarily exchanging goods and services. People can decide to produce if they want. They can decide what to buy if they want. Everyone's just free to pursue their own self-interest. And it's kind of, maybe it doesn't sound like it would be a great system because people are just being selfish and acting in their own self-interest. But Adam Smith a long time ago pointed out that there's many reasons why this type of system actually leads to much better outcomes especially than a command economy. Sometimes this is referred to as capitalism. And so again, the key thing here with a pure market system, you would have only a limited role for government, and that's mainly, upholding private property ownership and, providing public security. And there's again no pure market economies either. The U.S., Canada, even if I think probably the U.S. you can maybe think as the most maybe free market system, but there are many government regulations. The government, has quite a bit of a presence in the market system. So it's not a pure market system, but for the most part, it's not a command system. So once we look at the command system, I think it'll help clarify some of the issues here. So first, let's just talk about the benefits of the market system. So within a market system, there is consumer sovereignty. So if you think about the command economy, I just talked about it briefly, but you remember I said that the government decides exactly what consumers should buy. So the government decides how much milk should be produced, what type of milk should be produced, what kind of clothes people would want to wear, and they make all of those decisions. But in a market system, and so that's a top-down system. In a market system, it's bottom-up. And so we make the decisions as consumers about what is produced through our purchasing behaviors. You can think of our our dollars spending, or the amount of money we spend as being votes for certain things. So if a company opens up and tries to sell something that nobody really likes, then they're not getting many votes because no one's buying from them, right? And so then they go out of business. So that's a very important aspect. And that's probably one of the main reasons why so we've only experimented with command systems basically and market systems, and from what we see so far in our few hundred years of this type of system, it's been the only system that provides a very high standard of living. And one of the main reasons is because of the profit motive. The profit motive ensures that we use our scarce resources efficiently, both productively and allocatively. So if we remember those two measures of efficiency we talked about earlier, in a market system, there's the profit motive. So a company will be penalized automatically without any government presence if they don't produce efficiently. If they are wasteful, they don't make a profit, and that's their punishment. And so there's a very strong incentive to not be wasteful in terms of our scarce resources and to be efficient. A market system will also, guarantee that only goods and services that we actually want or need will be produced. And it sounds silly, but when we start looking at a command economy and the experiences we've seen with command economies, you see that we can't take this for granted. You can almost think like you could take this for granted in the system that we work. It would be crazy for someone to produce something that no one would want or need. But in command systems, it happened a lot. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But the main benefit of a market system is this built-in mechanism of the profit motive, which ensures efficiency. And it also is why we have, if you look at the smartphones that we have in our pockets, that's something that wouldn't even be thought feasible 40 years, 30 years ago. And so because of competition, coupled with the profit motive, there's a strong incentive for firms to be innovative, and not just in products, but innovative in their production methods as well to be very cost effective. Of course, there are many drawbacks of a market system, and this is why there's a role for government in a market system. So the one obvious drawback is that we have inequality. But a lot of people would argue that even though there's inequality, the people at the lower end are still better off. There's an expression, a rising tide lifts all boats. But still, nevertheless, some people get, it can be, a bit disconcerting when you have, people making millions of dollars a year and some people only making $20,000. Also, this profit motive doesn't provide any incentives for cleaning up an environmental spill. So any negative externalities associated with producing goods and services aren't internalized by the firms producing them. And so that's another drawback, and that provides another role for government. In a command system, unless they plan for unemployment, there won't be any unemployment. In a command system, everyone's assigned a job. So there's no such thing as a recession or anything like that, because the entire economy is planned, and you're not going to plan for that. But in a market system, since it's decentralized, there's recession. Sometimes there's just shocks to aggregate demand that push the economy into a recession. But there are built-in mechanisms that will result in us getting back to full employment. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the macro section of the course. But the main idea here is that it can be unstable, right? You have a business cycle, there's recession, there's unemployment. And then also think about the profit motive again. Companies, if all they care about is making profit, then, that means they're not going to care about treating their employees well. And of course, when the Industrial Revolution started, there were just many, many stories of, child labor, ridiculously long hours, and just very terrible treatment of employees. Over time, the government has become more involved, and there are, tons of different regulations, labor regulations and things like that. So again, you need a role for government. And there's other drawbacks that we haven't mentioned here, but you could also just think of a company that wants to raise money publicly. They could lie about how good the company's doing and try to cheat people. So if all they care about is profit, then there's many things that could be, bad about a market system. So there's definitely a role for government. And you could think of the market system is very good at generating wealth, and it's usually good, it's efficiently using our scarce resources, but it needs to be kept in check. And that's the role for the government. So again, a command system is when you have a central authority that makes most of the major economic decisions. And so it would be referred to as socialism, not what they talk about on the news, what the Trump supporters think socialism. Just because a country has funds a healthcare system, that doesn't mean they're socialism by definition means all means of production are owned by the government. And so in socialist countries, you have a centralized authority. And so the former Soviet Union is an example. China, it was an example up to about the early 80s. And then they started having more market systems. They have a communist government, but they have a market economy for not entirely, but for most of their consumer goods and services now are part of a free market, but they still have a communist government. That's a different thing. So anyways, a command system, you have a government that dictates the entire, they directly answer the three fundamental questions. All productive property, natural resources, and capital are owned by the government. So there's no such thing as, actually in these systems, like in the former Soviet Union, anytime you had a revolution and then you had communist control, they would remove property rights. There was this whole ideology that everyone should be the same and everyone should, work as hard as they can, but just take what they need and everyone shares. That was the idea. And so in those systems, there was no private property that was actually taken away. So again, they have a central plan that directs all economic resources. So even what is, what kind of clothing, what kind of socks people are going to wear, all that would be decided in the economic plan. And typically, since these, command economies were typically initiated under a socialist or a communist party, they had ideas of egalitarianism. So everyone should be paid equally, everyone should get an equal share. And so basically incomes were pretty much the same for everyone. Of course, there was all kinds of corruption, and a lot of times, people would not be happy to see that party members would have more than non-party members and things like that. But the idea was that. And there's still examples of these systems today. So North Korea is a command economy. Cuba is a command economy. And if you've ever been there, you can immediately, I've been there a few times on vacation, and it's interesting because you'll have money, but there's nothing to buy. They just have a set number of things that they make. It's dictated by the government, and that's it. They're slowly having more market involvement. So now you can own your own taxi, for example. The citizens are allowed to have a restaurant, but it can only have, a limited number of seats, maybe 10 seats or something like that. But that's, fairly new, I think maybe in the last 15 years. So there would have probably been a lot more changes in Cuba, but the Trump government, Donald Trump, when he got in, canceled all of that for whatever reason. But that's all political. And then, of course, Soviet Union, and that was in the past. And then also, Eastern Europe. And there was many other countries, too. The main ones now, today, are North Korea and Cuba. So there are benefits to having the government direct our scarce resources, right? But not, you don't want to have the entire economy directed. So things like military, of course, actually, you can't even have a military. There would be no way a private market system a pure market system would provide military service, because it's a public good, meaning that it's like a street light. If you put a street light up, everyone can enjoy the light, but it's impossible to remove that enjoyment from people who do not pay. So you have this free rider problem. Same with military. If you have who's going to pay for a military if they can't make people who are enjoying the benefits of it pay? And that's the problem with these types of goods. So there are many goods and that feature is called non-rival. I can't remember the name of it now. But the idea is you have this free rider problem, and so a private firm is not going to offer this good because people can, enjoy the benefits of it without paying. Same thing with like a fireworks display. typically those are subsidized by the government. A private firm is not going to set up a fireworks display because they can't prevent people from, sorry, it's called excludability. That's the word I was looking for. You can't exclude people who don't pay from enjoying the benefits, right? And so there are many goods that will not be produced if you just had a pure market economy. But nevertheless, some of these things we would want as a society, like a military. And so there's a role for government, and it's better to have, that's the only way is through the government providing that or subsidizing that or whatever. There's many times too where you need to have, like in this COVID-19 situation, you need the government to be able to just act quickly and direct large amounts of resources to solve a problem. And then just in general, as we mentioned earlier, a benefit of a command system would be that there's no business cycle. You don't need to worry about unemployment. But if you see how the standard of living was in these countries, you would be happy to settle for having a little bit of unemployment. Not only in command economies where the people were extremely poor, they just had no rights, and they had to do whatever jobs they were told, and you couldn't get ahead. So you imagine you try to work hard and get ahead. If you were caught doing that, in many of those systems, if you were thought of being a capitalist or having any capitalist sympathies, many instances you were killed or expelled to labor camps. So when you put things in perspective, the business cycle isn't all like that. But nevertheless, it is true in a command system, you wouldn't have any instability because the entire economy is planned. And of course, the main drawback of this type of system is the misplaced incentives. So if you're going to get an equal share of the economic pie, are you going to work harder than someone else? Or if you see people not working hard, but they're getting the same as you can imagine that has it doesn't really mesh well with human nature. And so one of the biggest issues with these types of systems is that there's misplaced incentives which lead to inefficiencies. There's no profit motive. So if someone in the bureaucratic system decides that they should use scarce resources to make a certain type of clothing, but it ends up being that no one wants it, then until they get an order to shut down that factory will keep producing that. And there's many stories where they would produce stuff and the managers only really, all that was mattered to them was that they made their quota. And so there's many instances where they would just, throw the production out in the back and burn it, but they kept going. In a market system, that wouldn't happen because, of course, of the profit motive. The incentive structure is more aligned, right? Where it's not. And also there's the opposite problem where you have shortages. If they, in the central plan, decide to, they make a forecast of milk or something like that, and they are completely off, then not enough gets produced and there's a shortage. In a market system too, if there's a shortage, the price will go up, and that'll help alleviate the shortage. And it'll also attract firms to want to produce that and satisfy that demand. But in a command system, that's not going to happen. And there's also a complete lack of freedom, economic freedom. You can't get ahead by working hard and, carving out your own little, nice home or something like that. That doesn't exist. Everyone's supposed to be the same and have the exact same standard of living. And then just think about what's another big inefficiency with that type of system is the amount of people that you need to administer one of these plans. So if you have 40 million people in your country, you're going to have thousands and thousands of people just working on this economic plan, updating it, implement all of this bureaucracy. And all of that labor effort could be used to actually make goods and services, but it's not. It's being used to have an economic plan. So that's another huge inefficiency. These are just some examples I found on the internet where you have, where these are examples of products that were made in communist countries. These ones are examples of poor allocated efficiency. So this is a kind of a funny example. This is called the boiling wand, and it would be used for travelers to boil water. Notice there's no ground on that, so you can imagine how safe that was, right? And but if the government decides that that's what the product that they want to produce for there's citizens that want to travel and need to boil water, then that's what they get. They cannot buy it, but that doesn't, that could be that's the only signal. But then, the government has no incentive to make a better one or another one. They might just say, well, then too bad, if you don't like it, we're not going to make it anymore. There's no profit model, right? So you can really see that, obviously even have issues now sometimes with the quality of our goods when we do have this built-in mechanism. But you can imagine there was zero incentive to produce a quality product because it didn't matter. No one was penalized if the products produced were not good, right? And so that's a big issue. There's another example in East Germany where the car that people could buy was made of cardboard. So this was compressed cardboard. It had no turn signal, no seat belts, no fuel gauge, and no trunk liner. So you can imagine how long that would last. So there's many examples of the types of goods that we produce in these systems. There's one example where there's a radio and you can't turn it off, and then of course it has one channel, and that's probably from the government. Another example of sort of wasted labor, scarce resources is in North Korea, where they have many traffic girls directing traffic, but there's no traffic. They're just there and they work and do that all day for some reason I cannot understand. I found that in a newspaper article. So it's just in these systems, there's, when you don't have that proper incentive structure, weird things can happen. And these weird things are very inefficient, and they lead to a lower standard of living. There's another example here where a factory in the Soviet Union made left-hand boots that nobody wanted, and at the end of the day, they would efficiently burn them, and the next day start again. And so I hope so with a command economy, it's doesn't score very well in terms of efficiencies. I'll just leave these for you to read later. These are just some other examples. And so, again, there are not really any pure command economies or pure market economies. Although I would say, when China became a communist country, so they had a revolution and the Communist Party took control in 1949. Within a few years, they had almost the entire country, so for example, people who owned farms, the farms were taken away from any landlords. Actually, a lot of them were either killed or expelled, and the land was just given to the people. But then after they created cooperatives, but there was just no more private ownership. And so in that case, there was all kinds of issues of, you have people who, if they work hard, they get the same as everyone else. So, productivity fell a lot. So anyways, but also, there were some systems that were very close to pure, socialist systems. But nowadays, even like I said, in Cuba, they have some market activity. It's although very small. But most countries in the world are mixed, and they have a sizable market economy. But at the same time, the government also has a large, sizable share, in terms of what they contribute to the economic pie, especially in terms of education and many public goods. So again, the need for the government is because of the market failures, like the inequality. So the government taxes people who make very high incomes, and they give some of that money back to the poor. So basically, the government, there's a role for government to minimize any issues with the market, provide public goods, redistribute income. The government also is very heavily, especially in the last, maybe 40 years, 30 years, they're better at, and they put more effort into sort of smoothing out the business sector. So if you were around in the Great Depression, when you had the stock market crash, the government behaved much differently than they do now. Back then, the government also cut back, and I think interest rates even increased. There was basically no government involvement in trying to alleviate the Great Depression. For now, we see with this COVID or even the financial crisis in 2008, the government steps up immediately to stimulate the economy. So there's fiscal policy, and then also in terms of monetary policy. There is a role, and that role has become much more important in recent decades. So that's so the main takeaway here is most all economic systems are somewhat mixed. Some have more of a market presence, like the United States, Canada, for example, than, say, Scandinavian countries like Denmark or Sweden. So there's a bit different, but they're all mixed economies. There's elements of a command system, and there's elements of a market system. And there's a large role for government to keep that market system in check. So if we look at an overview, command system is top-down. The government has an economic plan, dictates exactly how the economy should run. It directly answers the three different questions: what to produce, how to produce, and for whom. And it scores very poor in terms of efficiency. This is mainly because of misplaced incentives. And so our experience with this type of system has been sort of miserable, like in terms of material standard of living, it's very low, but then also these systems, it's actually very fearful to live in because of the ideology associated with communism. So yeah, didn't turn out to be the best system. Now it's important to think about, just to talk briefly about China. So China it had a command economy, but now it's transitioned into a market economy. It doesn't, but it's a bit different. It's a hybrid sort of. And I'm not too sure if there's any other examples similar to China, but it still has a communist state, so it doesn't have a democracy or anything like that. But there's a huge market presence, and in some cases, there's less regulations there than in, say, the U.S. or Canada. And so they've been able to pull more people out of poverty than any time in human history. In probably the 1980s, yeah, it must have been towards the end of the socialist era. Something like 80% of the population or more, maybe more than that, 85% lived in poverty. When after they started the market reforms in 1980, I think the last figure I heard was, less than maybe 10% live in poverty or even better than that. So they've taken, millions and hundreds of millions of people out of poverty very quickly. And, one of the reasons for that is they implemented more of a market system. So again, the market system is almost like the complete opposite. There's no central plan. It's bottom up rather than top down. The three questions are answered indirectly, right? So the what to produce question, we answer it, but it's indirect, right? It's through our purchasing behavior. The how question is answered by the firms themselves, but they have a strong incentive to not waste scarce resources. And the for whom question, it's not, the labor market essentially answers that question, although there's, it's kind of complicated. It's not it's not a perfect correlation if you were to think of it that way. But generally, if you have a scarce skill, and in a market, if something's scarce and there's a high demand, its price gets bid up. So if you have a skill that's very rare and not too many people have it, and there's a high demand for it, you're going to have a bigger share of the economic pie. If you have a skill that's easy to get, maybe only takes a month to learn, then it's not scarce. And so even in the face of a high demand for it, its price isn't going to get bid up all that much. So that's sort of, but there's all kinds of, exceptions here and there. And there's also non-market elements too, like unions and that sort of thing that can boost wages artificially compared to the market. So there's different things, but, for the most part, the, supply and demand of your skill determines your share of the economic pie. But it's, of course, much more nuanced than that. And again, because of the profit motive and in conjunction with competition, a market system scores very high, in terms of its efficiency. But at the same time, there's, a lot of negative aspects of a market system. And so there's a role for government to really help with that. And yeah, so that's the main overview of the two economic systems. We're just going to finish up with what's called the production possibilities. This textbook calls it the boundary, sometimes called the curve. It's just sort of it's a way to illustrate some of the concepts we learned, particularly the concept of scarcity, opportunity cost, and making choices. So it's just a very simple model, just to sort of think of it maybe as a bit of a framework to think about these concepts. So if we assume we're just going to, illustrate it with a simple two-product type of idea. So if you have a we can think of a deserted, our class is on a deserted island, and let's assume we just produce two things, food and shelter. Okay. And then, so this will be a little more clear when we look at the diagram, but we're also going to assume that the resource quantity and available technology are fixed at first. Then we can relax this and have some insights in what would happen if that was relaxed. And then along this boundary or curve, we're making the assumption that all resources are employed to their fullest capacity. And we're also thinking here of efficiency, as efficient as possible as well. And so if we have those assumptions, then we can, draw a curve like this. Let me just go back to that. So again, this production possibilities curve is just showing you the different combinations of the two goods that can be produced, assuming that all resources are being utilized. And we draw it with a concave shape. But just keep that in mind for now, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So the production possibility curve or boundary illustrates these three concepts. Okay, so here we have an example where we have two different goods, and we're just going to say one good is investment goods or capital goods, and the other is consumption goods. We could also think of having our deserted island here, and then we would have on either access shelter, and on the other one food. And so this line here would just tell us the different combinations that are possible of that we could produce of these two goods. So if we're here at this point, that means we're putting all of our scarce resources into producing investment goods. So if we do that, we would have zero consumption goods. If we put all of our scarce resources in consumption goods and none into capital goods, then we would be here. And, in the future, then we would probably have less consumption goods. So how does this illustrate scarcity? So I've talked a lot. I'll see if any of you guys want to contribute in the chat. So can anyone tell me how this diagram here would represent scarcity? Where is that implicitly illustrated here? Anyone?
Would it be on the zero or the maximum? Because it's
okay. So if there was no scarcity, where would we draw this line?
Be unlimited.
Yeah, there wouldn't be it would be unlimited, right? So because of scarcity, we can only produce so much, right? So basically that's along this line. It's because there are some unattainable combinations. This diagram is telling me that given our resources in this economy, we're not able to produce this much investment goods and at the same time this much consumption goods, right?
Right.
So yeah, so scarcity is just sort of because it has a boundary, right?
Yes.
What about choice?
Everything within the curve?
Yeah, and along the line too, right?
Yeah. I mean, everything that's shaded would be choice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So because this is what are the different combinations, but we can choose whether we want. Our economic system would decide. Well, and our preferences would be related to that. There's actually an economic theory associated with all of that, but we won't get into that. But we could be at point A, B, or C. You could think of at A would be where whoever is making the decisions in the economic system has decided that they're much more interested in the future than currently. And actually, in communist countries, interestingly, they would force the citizens to reduce their consumption so that they could put more resources into, say, industry and that sort of thing. In China, they did that. But the problem was the industry, they were making steel, but there was a very big disconnect between whether they actually needed that stuff in the economy because it was all just part of this big plan, right? And they would make these decisions, and then maybe 3 years out, they wouldn't have enough food, So, anyways, this is a bit of a side note, but your economic system could be such that there's more preference for investing in capital goods now, and if they do a good job at that, then you could be much wealthier in the future and have the potential for more consumption goods in the future. But, if you're at point C, that would be an economic system that's putting a heavy weight on just consumption. And so future, there's no investment in better production techniques and product that could lead to productivity and a better standard of living in the future. So choice is just indicated by where you would be on the curve. And now, how do we illustrate opportunity cost?
Would that be the difference between the points?
Yeah. So if you decide to go from A to so if you decide to let's say you're at first at A and then you decide to go to B, what's the opportunity cost of that decision?
Yeah, delta Y.
Exactly.
Right.
You have to give up this to get this.
Right.
So this vertical distance is always what you give up, and the horizontal distance is what you get as you go to the right. And so now we want to know why we drew this, concave like this. What's that? So when I draw this concave, I'm saying something about the nature of how resources are used in these two sectors. So, and one thing you can notice, if you were to think of different, let me just see if there's another slide that's got on it actually. Maybe, this slide, I'll just go back and finish and then we'll look at this numerical example. So imagine there was a bunch of delta x's that are all the same here, going from 0 to here. So, think of just the same increments going to the right. Well, for each, for the first, as we, move to the right, the delta y's get smaller and smaller. So at first, when we want to, it goes the other way around. They get larger and larger. So it's hard because this one's so large. But if you were just think about this distance here, this delta x. So when we increase the production of consumption goods by this amount, we give up this. Now, just assume that this is the same distance here. So then when I go from here to here, the delta y is much larger. So basically, when it's concave, we're saying that the opportunity costs increase. So there's increasing opportunity costs as we, produce more of one of the goods. And so the reason why we say that is just simply because resources aren't likely to be as productive in either sector. So if we were to think of huts and food and shelter, so think of this as food and think of this as shelter. So if we were first producing only food and then we want to decide to make shelter, what are we going to do? We're going to be efficient and on the curve, we're going to take workers who are the least efficient in food production and put them in the other sector, assuming they maybe have some, and we're going to take people who have skills in the other sector. So we would take the carpenters, right, first and have them into the shelter sector. And so we're not going to be giving up that much at first because we're going to take the resources that are least suited away and put them in the other sector. And so, but at some point, if you're going from if you're going to make more shelter and less food, at some point you're going to be taking away the really good resources, and this could be land too. You would take the land away from food production to build shelters on it. And then you're going to be giving up a lot, right? And so that's the idea. If this was a straight line, we're saying that the resources in our economy are equally suitable in either sector, and so the opportunity cost would always be the same. But when we draw a concave like this, we say that there's increasing opportunity costs. Does that make sense? No. So we're just saying that resources aren't equally suited in each sector. There's some resources, either labor resources or natural resources or something that are just better suited for other sectors. And so when we first start, if we were to think about being here and then moving to the right, at first, we're not going to take the very good resources from this sector. We're going to take the ones that are contributing the least to be efficient, right? We're going to take the resources that are contributing the least to whatever this good is on the y-axis. And so if we're taking the ones that are contributing the least from this sector and using them to make goods in the other sector, our opportunity cost is very low at first. But at some point, we're going to have to take the resources that are very good in this sector and use them to produce goods in the other sector. And so our opportunity costs will increase because of that. So let's do this numerical example. So we have data here for two goods, cars and wheat. And we have the different combinations. So how much cars, if this economy put all of their resources into making cars, how much would they be able to produce?
150.
Yep. If they put all their resources into making wheat.
100.
So those are the two, endpoints. And then in the middle are just where you're mixing. So if we go from point A to point B, we're saying that, at point A, we're just making wheat. But if we go to point B, we're going to make 50 cars and 95 units of wheat. So what's the opportunity cost of the 50 cars? So how much did we give up to get those 50 cars? So we were
50. Yeah.
So at point A, we just had wheat, 100 units. At point B, we have 50 cars and 95 units of wheat. So what did we give up to get those 50 cars?
I believe you gave up 5 units of wheat for the 50 cars.
You gave up 5 units of wheat. So you could think of here, obviously, we're going to use land that's not good to grow wheat on. And we're probably going to use some of maybe the labor resources that are more, probably if there's some mechanics, but maybe they're not good farmers, we're going to use them. So we get 50 cars, then we didn't have to give up that much because at first, you don't want to take resources that are the best at producing wheat because they're going to keep them from making wheat, not making cars, right? Now, if we do the same, so if we go, the problem with this here is they're not exactly, this isn't the same number, right? So, but you get the idea. You can see roughly that the opportunity cost here would increase. So even just going to, if we make 40 more cars, so that's less than 50, but we make 40 more cars and already the opportunity cost here is 10 units of wheat. And anyways, this will be a concave shape. If we looked at the differences and it was always the same, the opportunity cost was always the same, then it would be a straight line. So anyways, this is all the data for the production possibilities curve. If you plot it, it would look like this. So if we put all our resources into wheat, we have 100. That's an easy way to get your axis, the points on the vertical and horizontal axis. So on the vertical axis, if we put all our resources into wheat, we'd be able to produce 100 units. If we put all of our resources in the car production, we would be able to get 150. So those are the 2 points. And then, we can go and plot the points in between. So B is at 95 and 50. And so the opportunity cost is this vertical distance, which is 5. At 90, the vertical distance or opportunity cost is 10. So the opportunity cost of making 40 more cars, if you're already at 50, is 10. The opportunity cost of making 30 cars, if you're already at 90, is the difference here. I guess that's, is that supposed to be, this is 65. This should be up a little bit here. So yeah, and I mean, again, scarcity is, this resources are scarce, so we can't just produce unlimited amounts of wheat and cars. There's a limit to what we can do. We can't produce 95 units of wheat and 90 cars. We don't have the resources to do that. That's an unattainable point. But we certainly can produce this point. But this point wouldn't be efficient. So we're not using some of our resources, or we're doing something that's not making the best use of our available technology. Okay, so again, points on the curve represent the maximum possible, output given the available resources. The different choices, there's different choices, these are all different combinations that would make the best use of your resources, all resources would be fully utilized, etc. So scarcity again is represented by point. Well, it's either points on the curve because that's the best you can do, or this point illustrates scarcity because you can't have it because your resources are scarce. And then choice is obviously different points on the curve. It could even be in the curve if you were to think about choosing to be inefficient. And then opportunity cost is the downward slope of the curve. So if you think of lines tangent to this, that would give you the opportunity cost. Now, how would I represent an improvement in technology that leads to better productivity in the car sector, but it doesn't have any application in the wheat sector? How would I draw that? So if that's the case, if I put all my resources in the wheat production, how much would I get? Would I get the same as before? So if this new technology has no application in the wheat sector, how much wheat would I get? The same amount, right? So you'd still be at 100. But now if you put all your resources into car production, and, there's part of those resources is, some new tool or capital goods that lead to more productivity, then I would be able to produce more than 150 cars. So this would sort of come out and hit here, right? So it would stay there, but it would, I guess you could think of, rotate outwards. And if there's an improvement in technology that affects both sectors equally, maybe there's some kind of labor that, unskilled labor or something that can be used in both sectors and it has the same productivity in each sector. If that was the case, then we would just have a parallel shift outwards of this production possibility. This is just another illustration. I won't I pretty much talked about everything here. And again, the log increasing opportunity cost states that as you increase production of one good, the opportunity cost to produce an additional good will increase. Again, that's just the idea that, in the real world, there's likely going to be differences in the usefulness of resources in the different sectors. Some land you can grow wheat on, some you can't. Might be better to have a plant or some kind of manufacturing on. That's the idea. Okay, so that's the main concepts from chapter 1. Does anyone have any questions? Was it clear?
Yeah, it's clear.
Was it boring? Okay, so let's do a few multiple choice questions and then we'll call it a night. The first question is, a company's decision to introduce a new green car that is designed to appeal to consumers who are concerned about the environment is an example of which of these is correct. Oh, I don't know why so just, this is A, B, C, D, right? Now, this is, I don't want to say it's a trick question, but just make sure you think carefully of your answer to this. One of the answers may seem right, but it's not. So think about what exactly each of those questions mean. So what to produce, how to produce, for who. Just because something sounds similar doesn't. I'll leave it at that and see how you do. Okay, everyone put their answer in, right? How many do I have? Yep, 6 of you. Okay, perfect. So the correct answer is A here. Now, let's think about why. So you might have chosen for whom, but you have to be, think about what. So the what to produce question, how you answer that question. When you're thinking about answering that question, how do you answer it? Well, you want to know, you're just making a decision about what to do with your scarce resources. So in this case, in this economy, a company is deciding to make a green car because it appeals to consumers. So it has to do with the wants and needs of the consumers. And so, this is purely a what to produce question. The answer is a green car. Okay. Now, the for whom question, remember, is about who gets the economic pie, not a particular good or service. You're thinking about how the economic pie is being divided up. So if this had something, if this question had something to do with about the distribution of income, or it was about, the government taxed the rich and gave poor people money, or, or something about how incomes are being reduced or inequality or something like that, then you're talking about the for whom question. Does that make sense? And then if this question had something about how the green car was to be made, then we would be thinking of the how to produce question. Okay, so let me do your poll. Oh, how do I publish what you do? Can you see the poll results? There we go. So can you see the results?
Nope.
No?
Yes.
Oh, you can? Okay. So, good job. Most of you got it right. Okay, so new poll. Of course, each time I have to open a file to get the A, B, or C options. Okay. All right, so here we're told that the government is increasing taxes on high-income people by a certain amount, and it's reducing taxes on low-income people, and it's to increase financial support for unemployed Canadians. So, given what I just said, you should get perfect on this, right? Oh, someone got it wrong. Okay, I'll just 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's see how you did. Okay, good job. Most of you got it right. So again, clearly this question has something to do about income redistribution, right?
Let's see.
So it's a for whom to produce. There is no why to produce question. That's not a fundamental question. So yeah, the answer is C. Let me just give me 1 second. I'm going to fix the bullets on this. Give me 1 sec. Okay. All right. So can you see that question?
Yep.
Okay. Give me 1 sec. I'm just going to pull. Oh, actually, for this, you don't need a pull. So here we have a table with 4 different scenarios. The 2 goods are coconut and fish. And so what's the opportunity cost of going from A to B?
4.
Yeah. So in order to to get an extra fish, you had to spend more time collecting coconuts. In order to get a fish, you have to spend less time collecting coconuts. And so you have to go, do without some coconuts. How many coconuts did you have to do without? 4. And so the opportunity cost of 1 fish is 4 coconuts. What about catching an additional fish after you already caught 1?
12.
What's the opportunity cost?
12.
So if I catch 1 fish, I'll be able to have 20 coconuts. Now, if I decide, I'm going to catch another fish, how many coconuts do you have to give up?
8.
8, yeah. So it's the difference. And then the last one would be 12. So it would be 4, 8, and 12. Okay, here's a multiple choice question. Here's your poll. So which of the following is not considered to be an advantage of the market type of economic system? Okay, good job. Yep, perfect. So yeah, obviously E is not an advantage. Okay, next question. Just open poll. Okay, so in a market system type of economy, which of the following best describes how the production of goods and services is decided? So remember, this is a market type of economy. So we live in a market economy, right? For the most part. Who decides for McDonald's how they set up their restaurant in terms of how they make hamburgers?
McDonald's.
Yep. So let me reopen the poll. I'm going to close it and reopen it, and we'll try again. Okay, so let's try again. So the hint is D is not the answer. Okay, it is. There's a couple, 2 people who haven't answered yet. Okay, I'll close the poll. Oh, there's someone who hasn't submitted yet. Oh yeah, we got 6 now. Perfect. Okay. Okay, so the correct answer is B. So in a market type of system, A, it doesn't make sense. B is the answer, right? The how-to question is answered by the firms. So in a command system, the government answers that question, but in a market system, the how-to produce question is answered by the firms. If this was the what to produce, if we were thinking about the what to produce question, then D would be correct. Okay? And in a market system, the government does not develop detailed plans on how all goods or services are produced. That's a command system. Okay. Okay, next question. A market system type of economy is one in which one is correct? Okay, 3, 2, 1. And guess what? You guys got perfect. That's good. Yeah. So most economic decisions are made by consumers and privately owned business. Okay. Question 7's on opportunity cost. Here's your poll. So John gave Margaret a $20,000 painting for her birthday. Last week, an art dealer offered to buy the painting from Margaret for $25,000. She made a decision to say no, and that decision resulted in an opportunity cost of how much? What did she give up when she made that decision?
What was the answer? D. Jason, your microphone's muted.
Sorry about that.
Great.
So good job. Yeah, so you guys got perfect on the last one. Okay, so the next question, same graph, but different question. Here it's asking what the opportunity cost is of producing the first 700 quarks. You just get your tool here. There you go. Okay. Okay, so a couple got it wrong. So the correct answer here is C. Oh, actually, everyone got it wrong. So so you have to assume that you would be, if you're thinking about making 0 quarks, at first you would be at 20 here, right? And so if you go from 20 to 6, that would correspond to 700 quarks. Okay, so the first 700 quarks, we're saying we would be going from 0, which would correspond to 20 quarks, and so the opportunity cost would be 20 minus 6, so 14. Does that make sense? So you could think of being here at this point and going to point A. So from here to point A. So you would have to give up 14 quarks to get 700 quarks. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what determines which side you start on?
Well, just the context here. So basically, we're saying what's the opportunity cost of producing the first 700 quarks? So we're saying we don't have any quarks, and then we're going to go up to 700. So the only way you could produce, so you just got to think about being at 0 quarks, which means you would be producing 20 quarks, right? And then we're going to now produce 700 quarks. And so if we produce 700 quarks, so we're going from 0 to 700, then we must be going from here to here, right? And so 20 minus 6 is how much quarks you would have to give up in order to get 700 quarks. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So another, I think this is the last one. So again, we have the same graph. And now it's saying which of the following statements is correct if Mendorf is currently producing 500 quarks and 8 quarks. So where would that point be? Well, let me open your poll, sorry. All right, well, thanks everyone. Have a great night.
Great. Thanks.